Hey, brother friends and sister friends. Welcome back to the Heart Set Above podcast. Today we're talking about something I see all the time in my work as a therapist: fear. Fear is universal. It's part of the human experience. And honestly, it's not inherently a bad thing. Fear gets a bad rap sometimes, but the truth is, God designed our brains to feel fear for a reason. It protects us. It keeps us safe. My son, who's autistic, doesn't have the same fear sensors that most of us do, and it can actually be really dangerous and detrimental. Fear is meant to help us survive. It's a mechanism that God instilled in our brains to help our species continue on. Fear is a tool, a neural mechanism that God gave us to help us be protected. But here's the thing. Though we were meant to feel fear occasionally, we were never meant to be ruled by our fear. Fear is a tool that is meant to protect us from danger, but it was meant to be coupled with trust and faith so that we don't become consumed by it and fueled by it. Unfortunately, that's exactly what happens to so many of us. Fear seeps into every part of our lives. And of course, it looks different for all of us. For some of us, it shows up as anxiety, control, avoidance, anger, even perfectionism. But for most of us, we tend to be ruled by our fear a lot of the time. The cool thing is that God knows this about us. That's why he says over 300 times in the Bible, do not be afraid. And about 100 of those times, it's a direct command from God. Do not be afraid. Now, obviously, God is not saying, do not let your brain experience fear. Fear is an automatic response in our neural network. We have no control over feeling the emotion of fear. It's like saying, do not be attracted to that person or do not be happy. We have no control over that, but we do have control over whether we're ruled by it or not. Do not be afraid. It's as if God is saying, I know you. I know how easily fear takes over for you, and I need you to hear me. Don't let it rule you. You were not created to be fueled by fear. You were created to be fueled by love. And if you are fueled by fear, you'll start to short circuit. Things will start to break down. You were not made for that. But here's the thing. Just telling someone, do not be afraid, doesn't really seem to help, does it? I need more than that. I need direction. I need something to hold on to when fear feels suffocating. And that's why one of my favorite times that God tells us not to fear is in Isaiah 41:10, because he actually explains why we don't have to be afraid. Do not fear. Why? Because I am with you. Right? Don't be afraid. I'm here with you. Now, at first, that might not seem like enough. I mean, if I were standing in an open field with a friend and an asteroid started plummeting toward us and my friend turned to me and said, hey, don't worry, friend. I'll be right here with you as your worst fear unfolds and we're both consumed by a fiery, horrific death. I don't think that would make me feel any better. But what we know, both from scripture and from psychology, is that perhaps the deepest human fear isn't just about what might happen. The deepest human fear is being alone in it. Dr. Gabor Mate is a world-renowned trauma expert. He says that the human spirit is actually really resilient. We can endure so much as humans: suffering, heartbreak, trauma. But what we cannot endure, what is unbearable to the human spirit, is suffering alone. Think about that. Studies show that for most people, the hardest part of trauma isn't the trauma itself. It's the feeling of isolation in it. I see this in my therapy practice all the time. Let me give you an example. I once had a client, a woman in her 50s, who had been raped as a teenager. And she'd carried that trauma for decades. And when she finally came to counseling, she wanted to process it through the lens of her newfound faith. And she was very matter-of-fact about the details, which is common with trauma. She talked about how painful it was and how it shaped her life and how she'd always felt utterly alone in that moment. And as we talked, I gently asked her, what if you weren't alone in that moment? What if God was with you during that terrible moment of violation? What if he was grieving, heartbroken, furious on your behalf? And suddenly this woman who had been so composed, so detached, broke down in tears. She never even considered the idea that she was not alone in that moment. And that changed something in her. Even Jesus felt this. Look at Jesus on the cross. He was beaten, spit on, abandoned by his friends, falsely accused, tortured. And yet the only time we hear him cry out in agony, it wasn't during any of that. It was when God had to let him go. My God, why have you forsaken me? That moment, that separation from God, was the worst part of his suffering. Not the nails, not the mocking, not the false accusations. The worst part was being utterly alone in it. And that tells us something profound about the human experience. If Jesus himself, the Son of God, could endure every kind of suffering, but the worst part was feeling forsaken in that suffering, then maybe our deepest need as humans isn't for a perfect, pain-free life. Maybe our deepest need is presence. And that's exactly what God promises us. Do not fear. Why? Because I'm here with you. You are not alone. So what do we do with this? For me, when fear starts creeping in, I try to shift my focus. Instead of putting all of my energy into fixing the problem in front of me, I turn some of my attention to the presence that sits beside me. Because God doesn't just want to be the answer to your problem. He wants to be the comfort in your process. He wants to go through it with you, to be connected to you as you both endure it together. So, brother friends, sister friends, I don't know what uncertainties you're facing right now. I don't know what's weighing on your heart and what you're trying so hard to control or fix or prevent or avoid. But I do know this. You are not alone in it. God is with you. And maybe instead of trying to solve the fear, the anxiety, the uncertainty, maybe we could spend a little more time just noticing his presence in it. So today, let that truth wash over you. Do not fear. Why? Because he's with you. You are never alone. Thanks for hanging out with me today. If this episode spoke to you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Send me a message, share this with a friend who needs it, and let's keep having these messy but real conversations.